Thank you very much, Arthur. The happy thing about a lecture on energy is that it's a subject of enormous breadth, and I think I'm going to have to speak efficiently to get some of the ideas across that I think that may help answer the questions that at this point we are all concerned about. Certainly, I don't think there is a person left who drives a car in the United States who is not wondering about what is happening with oil and why we have the high oil prices. So I think I'd like to begin with a comment assembled by a colleague of mine from the Department of Economics at UCSD, and it deals with oil facts. So this is simply a historical summary of what's been happening, and I would like to tell you what I think some of you may remember, and many of you may not want to remember. In current inflation-adjusted dollars, oil reached a price of about $105 per barrel around 1980. This was after the Iran fiasco following the Carter, or during the Carter administration. The price then declined, and in 1998, which isn't all that long ago, we were back down to $15 per barrel, the same as in 1949. Iraq and Kuwait together have 8.8% of the worldwide production potential of oil in the world. The Iraq resources are enormous. They have been out of commission for quite a while now. When they get back into commission, our relief with lower oil prices ought to be considerable. Now let's take a look at the historical reasons for oil fluctuation prices. The oil supply disruptions, they ranged from 7.2% in October 1980. This was the Iran-Iraq War. To 7.8% in November 73, the Arab-Israeli War, to 8.8 to 8.9% in August 1990. This was the Persian Gulf War. And finally, the largest interruption was in November 78, during the Iranian Revolution, 10.1%, and also in November 56, the Suez Canal event. So when things go really sour in the Middle East, supply interruptions are considerable. They cause GDP, gross domestic product, changes with oil price changes, showing variable income elasticities in different countries and at different times. That's the history. This was a good summary of the history until about a month ago. Since then, a price of $105 a barrel way back in 1980 sounds like a pretty low price because we've exceeded it by almost 50%. Generally, when there has been an oil delivery interruption, the gross domestic product in the US has declined. However, as time has gone on, particularly because of energy conservation measures, the dollar value of oil used in the US has become very much less than it used to be in the past. It was only 2% from 1970 to 75 and from 1985 to 2003. It peaked around 8% in 1980, and it was 4% in 2007. Of course, it's higher now, but I don't have data for 2008. And of course, because most of the oil is used in the private transportation sector, there is an immediate reaction by consumers, like myself, buying cars with high mileage. I bought the second Prius model when it came out, didn't trust the first one, because you never trust the first example of anything. The second one in 2002, and I still get about 45 to 55 miles per gallon, depending on where I drive and how I drive. This is the kind of adventure that makes a conservative driver out of you, because you know that when you go over 65, it's going to cost you extra. In many ways, because there may be policemen around who have some idea of what they should be doing. So we have this sad history that large oil price increases reduce American GDP. I will refer at the end of the lecture to a book that I got just about a week ago, written by an economist. Economists and engineers have completely different points of view about what is important and what isn't important. But what is interesting about this book is that the author uses his reading of science and engineering to make the flat assertion that 50 years from now, we are still going to be using mostly oil and natural gas products to power our economy, no matter what we do, even if we go on a violent construction program of nuclear reactors, say, which we can't really do anyway, because we take such an enormously long time approving one before we even build the next one. We have not yet built even the first generation 4 nuclear reactor. They're the ones that I talked about, I think, in my last appearance here, and I'll say a few words about it. Now, you may want to know why I think that I'm qualified to talk about energy anyway. Well, let me say that I had a job right after the war. Well, in fact, let me say that I'm really a physical chemist. My PhD is in physical chemistry from the University of Wisconsin. But I was not in school very long, because these were the wartime years. In 1944 and 45, I spent at an Army research laboratory working on rocketry. So I became a rocket engineer in that period. And after that, I had my first experience with oil, because my first job after the PhD was with the Esso Research Laboratory in Linden, New Jersey. And I became a real oil engineer then, because there were some things we had to do, which I did regularly. On Thursday evenings, we bowled together if we worked at this laboratory. If you didn't bowl on Thursday evening, you didn't get promoted. So naturally, we all went there. And I met some very interesting people there, not only the ones working on the kinds of problems I was working on, but the people in recovery and exploration. And I used to ask them, where do you drill? How do you know where to find the oil? And they told me in detail how they took careful measures of the topography, and before they went and drilled anything, they put all that science together, and then they called in a couple of people with divining rods to make sure that they drilled in the right places. But that was 1946. I don't think that's done anymore so much today. In 1972, I had a sabbatical leave. And this was a great experience for me, because during a sabbatical leave, it's sort of like having a Sabbath every day of the year for a whole year, which is kind of pleasant. And I had an around-the-world sabbatical, which I planned very carefully, and I could visit all kinds of people who were very knowledgeable and very interesting. And I thought this might be a great time to find out what these intelligent people thought was going to be important in the future. We started this adventure in England, natural place, everything starts in England, at Oxford and Cambridge, and particularly in London at Imperial College. And from there we went to Aachen in West Germany, and then naturally to Switzerland to ski. I didn't talk too much about future scientific issues then, but then came a long holiday in Italy at Milano and at Naples and in Rome, and from there we went to the Technion in Israel, and from there, believe it or not, to Tehran in Iran, where there were colleagues that I had known for a long time, and This was when the Shah was still in power, and so on, around the globe ultimately. I forget how many people I talked to. I always asked these people on my first meeting a very simple question. What do you think is going to be important in the future? Where do you think one should be working if one wants to be prepared for the most critical issues? And by the time that trip was over, when I came back to UCSD, I was sure that the only subject that merited unlimited attention were energy issues. I think it's interesting that as far back as 1973, I would sit down at the University of Western Australia with my colleagues at tea. They did it the way it's done in Oxford. And we talked about critical issues for the country. And even then, 1973, in an affluent country like Australia, the people who lived there were sure that energy problems were going to be of paramount importance. This was an enormous education for me. It would never have occurred to me when I started that this is where I would end up. However, after I got back to UCSD, I learned that I really didn't have to go anywhere to find this answer, because the chancellor of our university had come to the same conclusion, staying home. And as a result of that, the UCSD Energy Center was founded in record time. It was founded in 2 days. Official approval from the university hierarchy took a year. But right after I came back in '73, I assembled a group of very competent graduate students and undergraduates and set up the UCSD Energy Center. And we had no problem in getting it funded, almost from day one, because I had a friend at San Diego Gas and Electric that happens to be in California, and the California legislature had already ruled that the utilities had to give money to the universities in order to support their energy conservation programs. So as the result of these episodes, we had an energy center, I'd say roughly a week after I came back, which was not approved officially, but functioned officially almost immediately. And it functioned in many ways. First of all, the classes were set up in the fall quarter, which was a few weeks after I got back. And I taught my first course on energy. It was a course, Demands, Resources, Impact, Technology, and Policy. So I didn't leave much out in these first lectures. And this was a time when we had one of the critical oil embargoes, shortages. And the student interest in energy was fantastic. That is, our freshmen and sophomores flocked to the class in such numbers that they were about 50% more than I could have room for. They were sitting in the aisles, one next to the other, sometimes one on the lap of another, but anyway, it was a very crowded room. And I talked about 4 topics or 5 topics about which I needed to learn a great deal: demands, resources, impact, technology, and policy, none of which I'd ever worked on before. The next year, in 1974, we completed our first text on this topic, and it was published by Addison Wesley Publishing Company, the Advanced Book Program, in 1974. And then there was shortly thereafter followed by Non-Nuclear Energy Technologies in 1975, and in 1976 by Nuclear Energy and Energy Policies. I think ours was the very first energy center set up at a public university in the United States. Berkeley followed us within about a year, but we were really first. Well, this tells you a little bit of the background and how I got involved in all this stuff. And then now I would like to comment briefly on the political environment. We got support, as I said, almost immediately from San Diego Gas and Electric Company because the state legislature had written into their books a requirement that the utilities had to support energy research, meaning in this case energy conservation research, at universities. And I was fortunate in having a close friend there who happened to be in charge of special funds, Otto Herr, who died recently, a very nice man. And so we had an adequate supply of funds to do all the things we wanted to do and start working at the beginning on energy conservation issues. Now, most of us just went through the reporting of the selection of a Democratic presidential candidate. And I thought that it was very interesting information for me to listen carefully to what the candidates had to say. This was TV interviews and radio broadcasts by their supporters and their opponents. One of the first people I listened to was Barack Obama, Senator Obama, and he talked very intelligently about energy. I thought he was aware of the fact that there was a major problem. He was aware of the fact that something needed to be done about the major problem. And he said what was obviously going to have to be done was to divert farm produce for the production of transportation fuel. Well, that rubbed me the wrong way, I must say, because by the time this interview came, I had written or assembled also as editor, I think it was a 15-author collection for an encyclopedia of physical science and technology dealing with energy issues. And included in that collection, the paper by a very competent entomologist from the Cornell University, whose thesis was that one couldn't really divert biomass for energy without wrecking food production. And I had talked to him a couple of times. I read his article very carefully, and I thought it was a very well thought out conclusion. And so when Senator Obama came up with this idea that we can replace oil with biomass, I felt kind of worried. And of course, we all know that the effort to do that has come out exactly the way Pimentel from Cornell University predicted, that there was an enormous rapid increase in the price of the input material, which was believed originally to be only corn. I think that as time has gone on, it's become clear to many people that biomass for fuel is not a viable technology. There's lots of sunshine around. They like to quote the number 2,500 times the daily input that we need for all of the energy used on the planet. That's correct. But to grow food, we need more than thus energy. We need land and water. And they are both, depending on where you are and at what times you look at the problem, in short supply. And as a result of this, I am very skeptical about this idea of supplementing energy supply with biomass converted into alcohol or some other fuel that can be used for transportation. I'll come back to this thing because I think this is just the worst possible plan that we could have. Anyway, Senator Obama did not say where the biomass was coming from. He was sure that there must be biomass that is not important for food production, and we could then use that and make the energy business sound. Well, the next person I listened to was Hillary Clinton, Senator Hillary Clinton. And I was quite bothered by what she said because her only comment was that this whole energy mess was produced by bad people in the oil business. And although I was no longer working for Exxon, I didn't think they were necessarily bad people. And her idea was that all you need to do is pay the taxes on the gas that people buy during the succeeding summer and punish the oil companies by making them pay for this extra cost. And then I listened to Senator McCain. This was just before the Indiana and where was it? The other Indiana and North Carolina elections. Well, Senator McCain wasn't really even talking about energy supplies. He was talking about global warming. And he made a very benign comment, which I like to this day. His comment was, even if we are wrong, and that's quite a concession from someone high up in politics for anyone to make, he said, we'll leave a better world behind us if we reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. I have no problem with that conclusion. I think that's a very nice conclusion. And I think my friend would say that's because you're a conservative Republican that you say it's a nice conclusion. Well, perhaps it is. But in any case, getting off this tremendous addiction to fossil fuels, particularly for someone with a nuclear energy bend that I have, is a good thing. So I don't have any problem with aiming in that direction, but not at the price of wrecking our economy for probably decades, which is probably the price we would have to pay if we really went all out for the change that will inevitably come. So let me talk about energy conservation a little bit. That's been a real success story. There's no doubt about that. The energy content that we require on the average is down to about 2% of total energy use, of total energy availability. And this is due to conservation measures of every conceivable type. Of course, these must include personal measures. That is, we have to have the habit of turning off unnecessarily energy-using lights. We don't always do that. We sometimes air-condition cold rooms, making them a health hazard, and that certainly shouldn't be done, and so forth. This part of the story, the energy conservation story, has been a real success. It's been a real success, especially in the transportation sector. If you think of going from maybe an average, well, my first car was a Model A, and I hate to tell you how many miles per gallon I got with that thing. It was somewhere around 10 miles per gallon. Most of it wasn't even burnt, it was just exhausted. But my current car, as I say, is a Prius, the second model, and that's not 8 miles per gallon, that's in the 45 to 55 miles per gallon range, which tells us that there is enormous conservation elasticity in the system, provided we have ingenious use of technology that isn't going to come about by itself. And there are many, many other examples of energy conservation being totally benign and very, very efficient. Let's take, for example, the energy use that goes with electric lighting bulbs. There's been a tremendous decrease in energy requirement for this new generation of bulbs. They've got other problems. There's a disposal problem with those. We don't quite know what to do with this stuff. We don't quite realize yet what the cost of that might be. But in any case, we're doing in our industrial system incredibly much better than we did before. And that is why the energy cost of production is down in the couple of percent range. And it has affected every part of our lives, that we have much better technologies, We can listen to wonderful music with a Bose system that is a tiny little system. It fills up the whole room with wonderful music, and it is a low energy consumer compared to this kind of systems that we had even 20 years ago. Wherever you look in our industrial development, we've had a tremendous success. And I think that there is a great deal of leverage left in that sector, that we can anticipate that in the future, our energy use for personal services, for production, for transportation, for just about every activity will decrease considerably. And that is certainly something to look forward to. Well, I want to come back to biomass conversion because this is something I've been involved in for a long time, although I am not a plant physiologist, and my knowledge and wisdom on this is strictly secondhand. During the Carter years and thereafter, there was a great deal of talk about biomass use for transportation. Many, many people worked on it. Those of you who are recent entries into the energy policy arena may think that it's just been invented, but it was all invented during the Carter years. As a matter of fact, everything we do today was invented during the Carter years, the first time we had a real energy crunch. There isn't one technology that I know about that wasn't discussed at great length during the Carter years. And I don't say that only because I was deeply involved in these deliberations in Washington. I say it because it really happened, that there is nothing really new that anyone has come up with during the last few decades that wasn't at least discussed at length, way back in 1980 and beyond. Well, coming back to biomass, a friend of mine at Berkeley, a very famous friend actually, Melvin Calvin, I think the chemists in the audience will remember that he got the Nobel Prize for inventing or for describing photosynthesis in detail. So a very reputable scientist. He called me up one day and he said, well, I've got the solution to our oil shortage. There is a plant growing in the desert, and if you treat this plant properly and distill it, you end up with a hydrocarbon composition that simulates oil. And this plant grows like a weed, and it's very cheap, and we can do our own oil substitution just with this one plant. Well, he sent down a description of it, particularly an analysis of what he got when he decomposed and distilled this material. And indeed, it was a hydrocarbon mixture, very much like gasoline. And then I talked with him several times. Finally, he came down to UCSD to educate the unbelievers that this was the solution. And he showed me his calculations of costs, and it all looked fine. And finally, I asked a dumb question. I said, what land are you going to use to do this? And what is it going to cost for the land? By that time, I made sure that I had a competent economist in my office to help with the discussion. Oh, he said, the land's not worth anything. We can just get that for nothing. Well, he looked into the land not costing anything, and he found that every piece of land he looked at had an owner, and every owner wanted something for the use of the land. And by the time you factored that in, the cost of Melvin Calvin's gasoline substitute was substantial, much higher than the then cost of gasoline. I think it'd be worthwhile looking at this again today and seeing how this shapes up at the present time. I don't know of any substitute materials or plants that really do the job. I have to go on and tell you a little bit more about biomass because I have looked at this problem on and off for a long time, and it always comes out pretty dismally. Let me give you an example. we know that the politicians, all of them, without exception, whatever their color or conviction may be, have the illusion that they can get substitute transportation fuel by growing plants. And then the next statement is, look at the energy the sun delivers to the planet. It's 2,000 times what we use in the course of a year. Well, how can you object to that kind of a supply? But as I said before, there is more to growing plants than having the energy. You have to have the land and the water. And on that score, we haven't gotten anywhere at all. I got a paper just a couple of months ago for a meeting at Graz University in Austria. This is a very good meeting that I usually go to. There are all the people with political convictions diagonally opposed to mine, so I enjoy going there and listening to them, and I learn a great deal from them all the time. In this case, there were a couple of Brazilian authors, and of course Brazil is always cited as the place for conversion of biomass to fuel, because they get their alcohol from sugar waste. And when we tried that, by the way, in the late 20th century in the United States, we found out that there were very few places in the United States with a climate that was sufficiently close to the Brazilian climate, notably the lower tip in Florida, just about the only place where the rainfall was adequate and where we could get some numbers like the Brazilians. But what do the Brazilians say, not about sugarcane, but about corn productions? They were going to make biodiesel. Here's what they said. Biodiesel production from soybeans, as proposed and implemented until now, is not a sustainable alternative, and large-scale production puts high stress on the environment and biosphere. Furthermore, the renewable fuel fraction is only 30% of the input fuel fraction required to grow the stuff in the first place. The authors are from the State University of Campinas in Brazil. And I read articles like this on and off all the time. In fact, wherever I look, even in science, there was a trio of biofuel letters, and the date on this is the 13th of June 2008, so it's not really ancient history. There are 3 articles in there. One is on biofuels, Waste Not, Want Not, and it is written by authors from ETH, that is the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule in Zurich, and Singapore, collaborating on making biofuels. And what they come out with is an optimistic summary that, well, this may be worth trying. That's all they've really been able to establish. This is after quite a few articles were published in Science indicating that the production from corn was totally ineffective, and much as Kelvin's original investigation, a very poor use of a farm product, and did not really produce any kind of successful biomass for fuel. Then there's an article in here, again, this is June 13th, 2008, just a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago by now. The headline is, Biofuels Too Soon to Give Up. Now that's an optimistic statement. This comes from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it's got no scientific content at all. It's just an expression of hope that we may be able to do this. And the third article is by Roger Sedjo, whom I know very well. He's a very competent plant physiologist. He's an expert on how to grow forests and keep trees healthy. And I had heard this remark from him many times before at meetings, because we both served on an on a commission for improving public education, which of course is certainly a worthwhile thing to do, particularly at the lower levels where we have these dismally inaccurate textbooks. And he has a great idea. He says, don't use corn. It obviously doesn't work. Let's use switchgrass. Well, switchgrass is self-pollinating, and it doesn't need very much water. In every way, it's a much better choice. And can you do it that way? Well, this proposal has been around for at least 20 years, and I haven't seen any data. So I can't really say whether this is or isn't successful. I think it's going to be problematic because switchgrass, like corn, uses up valuable land space, it uses up valuable resources. So there is a real problem with that too. And I think that Sedjo's proposal to study switchgrass is certainly worthwhile, a university small-scale program to see if that proposal has any merit. But then remember, I'm prejudiced because he's a friend of mine. So naturally, I say we should try it. Then there's a fellow sitting next to me at the university, his office is right next to me, who's now with private support in the business of waste to energy. Well, waste encompasses many things, and I spent about, I think, 20 years working on waste to energy. This was my main activity for a long time. I was on the board of Ogden Corporation, which was the largest company, the largest builder of municipal waste conversion to electricity. It was a nightmare because the president of the company had the bad habit of sending me to these opposing meetings with environmentalists of the sort that Arthur encounters sometimes to defend what we were doing. And the issue there was dioxin emission. Dioxin is an extremely toxic compound. We didn't really know how to measure small concentrations. We could measure 1 part in 10 to the 8th or 10 to the 9th or even 10 to the 10th from the beginning, but the analyses cost like $120,000 a piece, which even for a big company, by the time you do hundreds of these at all your plants, gets to be a prohibitively expensive activity. Well, there was an $8 billion, believe it or not, international program to learn how to measure dioxin in municipal waste. And after that, the price went down from $120,000, $150,000 per analysis, all the way to about $8,000 per analysis. And by that time, the people who were opposed to municipal waste incineration had decided that this stuff was so toxic that everybody in the United States who was still whole would be immediately subject to some dreadful reaction to dioxin poisoning even if the concentration was at the limit of measurement, 1 part in 10 to the 13th. That's getting to be pretty small. And right about that time, the analysis came out that wasn't even good enough. We got to do 1 part in 10 to the 14th. And that killed the Ogden company. It went out of business. This was a big multi-billion-dollar company. It was bought out by another company and stayed in the business and is still building municipal waste incinerators, but they're being built in Poland and Eastern Europe and Russia, and nothing's being built in the United States. So the waste-to-energy business in the United States, which could contribute 10% of the energy we need from materials that we don't need at all, is essentially dead, because we can't go down to 1 molecule at a time, and if 1 part in 10 to the 14th is not good enough, the analysis become beyond affordability. Well, anyway, the fellow who sits next to me got some private money, and believe it or not, this is a private entrepreneur. He says he doesn't know anything about dioxin, and he doesn't want to know anything about dioxin. He just wants to burn waste and make energy. And so that's what they're trying to do. But not with the huge plants that we had, but with a small-scale plant. We had one plant in Connecticut where the environmental concentration of dioxin was higher than what we were emitting from our plants. But we had to shut down our plant because it was over 1 part in 10 to the 13th. Look, that's sheer lunacy. I mention this because there are some wonderful ideas that have been scuttled that shouldn't have been scuttled. This is certainly one of them. Let me say one more thing about this type of activity, or about the Carter years and the programs that were not adequately evaluated in this biomass conversion business. The idea of growing algae as the biomass for conversion. This merits some study because we don't really quite know how this is going to come out. Plants grown in canals, mid-ocean plantations, these are all ideas that were kicked around that really haven't been tried very well. Now let's talk about the big fossil fuels, the big sources which supply most of our energy. Coal, for example. We are the kingpins of the coal business. We have the world's richest resources. China is a second, but not even a close second. Our resource base is very, very large. If we wanted to, and we are going to have to, you continue using coal. I want to refer to a paper that was just published. Could you show the small one first, the next one, not that one, the next one. I want to call your attention to two publications that you may find very interesting. This is one that I just got a couple of weeks ago, World Energy Supplies, written by an economist. It's a very readable book, and the reason why I mention it is that you can pick this up and he won't confuse you with dioxin measurements and other stuff like that. He will just tell you the facts as they are, and the fact as he sees them is that 50 years from now, our energy supplies must still come from fossil fuels, no matter what we do, because we simply can't construct other plants fast enough to have a reasonable chance at substitution. And he makes the same comment about nuclear energy also. I'm very sorry to say I have to agree with him. We couldn't have an urgent nuclear program that would get us into a nuclear economy in 50 years. We are stuck with the fossil fuels for the time being. Nothing else, considering the magnitude of what we use, will do. And if we stay in this fossil fuel business and continue to use coal and natural gas, especially those two, and other fossil fuels, we will have adequate supplies, but they will be fossil fuel supplies. And this vexing problem of what to do with the carbon dioxide that Arthur and others are going to have to solve, I can't solve that. This is going to be with us for sure for a long time to come. And speaking about this, I do want to tell you an anecdote that isn't an anecdote, unfortunately, because it's true. I listen to the German program Deutsche Welle occasionally, and they had a program about a German city called Uelzen, which is in the middle of Germany, a smallish city, probably about 30,000 population, which when you get anywhere near the city has big signs, "We are totally green." And when you leave and look back, there's another sign, "We are totally green." We don't use anything but energy from plants for transportation, for supplies. Well, it so happened that this program on the German television station gave us a background on where this energy came from and what was being done in order to make Uelzen in central Germany totally clean. clean meaning green. There were some young environmentalists who were leading one of the parliamentary chiefs who had been instrumental in making this German program a reality, who were sort of dragging her around to see what was going on. They went to Indonesia, where the rainforest had been partially replaced by palms, little palms. The palm oil was being used as the green fuel source. What was the price for bringing this to a German city? The price was first that the native population living in this area was very much at risk and couldn't possibly survive, because instead of having the large canopy cooled above their heads, they were suddenly exposed above these small palms to brutal heat, and they showed some of the people there and how their families lived and how they were being disintegrated. That was one side effect. Well, that's only humans. I mean, so you don't worry about that. But then you look around and you find the orangutan population of great apes was being decimated, literally decimated. The young apes were being tranquilized, packed up like baggage, loaded onto ships, and moved to Malaysia in the hope that they could find a home there. They didn't exactly say what they were doing with the adult orangutans, but my impression was that they were either killing them or letting them die out. So here you have an example of a really brutal intercession for the purpose of having a small town in a developed country go green at the expense of a native population and the animals living in that area. I don't think there are many people here who would support that kind of a program. But anyway, that's biomass conversion in the rough. Now I want to go to a somewhat different topic. Can I show the second small chart? I've mentioned that book that I think you will find interesting and readable. There is a release from the National Academies, a pretty objective release. And the whole purpose of that release, which you can get for free from the internet, is to provide a readable document for the public at large on what the issues and facts are about the energy programs in the United States and in the world. So if you want a great tutorial, I would recommend that you get this from the internet. Let's see. The article that I refer to, the Economist article, is World Energy in the 21st Century. The author is John R. Moroney, M-O-R-O-N-E-Y. And this, all you need to know about energy, it's about a 40-page article. It has some biases, but mostly I think it's a good objective production. You can unload that for free from the internet and get quite an education, because they do cover just about every aspect of the energy issues. I now want to go back to something that I talked about. Oh, my time is just about up. How much time have I got, Arthur?
Got about
5 minutes?
no, you have more than that. You have about 15 minutes.
Oh, good, good. No, not this one. I want to show the one with the chart. A long time ago, I think must be somewhere around 2002, I gave a lecture to this meeting, and I prepared what was then a summary, and still is, of our energy resources and supplies worldwide. And the supplies were what we were using today, with 60% energy savings over a 50-year period, and getting all the people, which we expect around 2050, to be on this overcrowded planet, namely as many as 10 billion people. I don't know how you feel about that. I think we have enough now. We don't really need more, but then I'm probably biased there. In any case, a planet with 10 billion people enjoying our standard of living in the year 2000. That's the important point, which we could reach with energy conservation. And then ask the simple question, what we know about supplies, how long would they last? And those numbers are given in this last column here, which most of you probably can't see. But it is worthwhile. I got a toy somewhere here that has, oh yeah, here it is, that has a little focus on it. You probably still can't read it, but I can tell you what I'm pointing to. The first thing I'm pointing to there is how long the supply of fusion energy would last. If with this scenario, 10 billion happy people on the planet living as well as we lived in the year 2000 in the United States. That's quite a job, because we were by far the heaviest energy users, and I'm assuming here with this scenario that we're all entitled to the same great standard of living. That's 3 billion years. Well, in 3 billion years, the pundits tell us that the solar disk will cool and expand, and then we get a kind of a deadly solar embrace by cooking our entire planet. So we don't really have to worry beyond 3 billion years. So with fusion energy, 3 billion years, and with nuclear breeder reactors, which I've mentioned before also, it's just about as long, 2.5 billion years. That is, we have total nuclear solutions that we know about now, one of which is in the process of being built at Karadash in France, the fusion reactors, and the other one of which has already been built on a full commercial scale in France. They had a 1,000 megawatt breeder reactor operating properly. And so we have the technology and the means over the long term to go nuclear by one or the other of these means, one of which has already been tested to take care of the planet essentially forever. And this would remove our energy agony almost forever. Well, it's too hard to read that little stuff up there, so I'll refer to my paper and I'll give you some other representative numbers. These are numbers that you can find in this encyclopedia article, and they're also numbers that I have discussed here before, so they're not new to you. The opportunities for taking care of our energy supplies are very, very large. We can do it in many different ways. And if we pick biomass to energy, we chose the worst possible way, which is politically very popular right now. Let me now talk about ordinary reactors, fission reactors. That's 20 million years with that scenario. Again, the 10 billion people living happily the way we lived in the year 2000. And if we go to fusion reactors involving lithium in seawater, it's almost as long. It's about 2 times 10 to the 6. That's 2 million years. Well, let me go down to something very much more near term, like the worldwide fossil fuel resources. And here I would include shale oil, coal, oil from tar sands, petroleum, natural gas liquids. We have at least 1,000 years of supplies of these fossil materials. And if we go to hydrothermal energy, then it begins to get very dismal, because we are already exploiting almost everything that's available. And with hydrothermal, in California, at the geysers, 20 years supply, because our supply is so much larger than what we know anything about. and also this program that Edward Teller was interested in, the hot dry rocks. This would also be on this order, 20 years supply for the world as a whole, which doesn't mean that for us, we are a very small part of the world as a whole, that wouldn't be like a few hundred years. So we do have alternatives for ourselves. The thing that we are always told is that the multiple of need coming from the sun is 2,500 times for this total energy supply. And that's renewable now until the sun cools down and takes care of everything that remains on the planet. That's a great resource, but we are in very poor shape using solar energy directly. Only photovoltaic conversion has not really ever gotten off the ground. It's still probably about 20 times more expensive than anything else we do. I know that there are enthusiasts who say that's a temporary number, but I've heard this story about the temporary number since I've been in the energy business, which is 35 years, so I'm not so sure it's really so temporary. Wind energy, there's a lot of wind around. I heard one of the great politicians on television talk about wind energy as the total solution. There is about 1,000 times as much wind on the globe as we need, and it was Boone Pickens. Boone Pickens, he was on television. He suddenly became an energy expert too. He was going to build wind farms running from southern Texas to the northern border with Canada. One wind farm after another. He thought that was the way to solve our energy problems. In the meantime, wind remains, let's see, I'm going to talk about San Diego now. Wind remains at the 2% level in San Diego. And we are a very progressive society, so I suspect that this is probably as good as it gets. Ocean thermal energy conversion, which people haven't talked about in recent years. This is 190 times as much. The reason they don't talk about it very much is because presumably stirring up the oceans like this frees carbon dioxide that is in the oceans. I say presumably because we have no measurements on this. In the meantime, that technology is pretty well developed. It was a major thrust beginning around 1980, and the US Navy was very interested in, because they're mostly in the water, so they like this kind of a source. And it is an important potential contributor. The other that we don't know anything about are, well, I should mention them. We do know them. We are using them in very small amounts in selected parts of the globe now. It's first of all geothermal energy, as at the geysers, tidal energy, as off the coast of Newfoundland and in Ireland, and hydroelectric energy worldwide. Well, that's become a problem. This used to be a good supply, always very clean, always immediately approved. And then somebody figured out that where these plants were supposed to be built, there were preferred colonies of fish, and that we better stay out of the waters and let the fish have the rivers and stop building hydroelectric plants. I think it's going to be very hard to build any more of those anywhere. Besides, it's a negligibly small resource compared with the other things that we are talking about. And then there are things that are yet to be tested, like the concentrated methane at low depths, which would be a tremendous source of natural gas if we ever figure out how to get this. I'd like to close with a realism reminder. I live in San Diego. I have in front of me the power content for 2007 and 2008. In 2007, renewable resources provided 10% of our energy, and that means mostly geothermal and small hydroelectric. And in 2008, we estimate that this 10% will shrink to 8%. That's going the wrong way, presumably, because we're supposed to increase this rather than having it decrease. Geothermal energy went from 2% to less than 1%. That's a local problem in Northern California. Small hydroelectric went from 6% down to 1%. Solar energy, less than 1%. Wind energy, big growth, 2% to 3%. Coal use way down from 32% to 10%, but natural gas use from 31% to 58%. So there we are using a great resource, cleaner than the coal, and for construction reasons, readily available in San Diego. And as a result of that, we can use more. We are going to use much more. In fact, this is our dominant source for energy supply. Nuclear energy was only 3% in 2007 because we had some problems with our plants. It'll be back up to 19% this year. All other adds up to 0. That's the story on a living utility in the current year. It tells you how far we have to go to find the renewable solutions.